we've had a few close calls with nuclear. Armageddon, the Cuban Missile Crisis, various false alarms, and even a few accidental bomb drops were just some of the moments when the Cold War between NATO and the Warsaw Pact threatened to become a hot one. But one of the nearest misses that's arguably less well known came in November 1983 with exercise Able Archer, a NATO simulation so realistic that the Soviets thought it was the real thing. Able Archer was possibly one of our closest brushes with nuclear Armageddon. It had Soviet intelligence assets extremely worried that what they were picking up may not actually be an exercise, but a NATO preemptive strike against the Soviet Union, and that missiles like Polaris, which we can see behind me, could soon be raining down. In this video, we'll take an in-depth look at the events of 1983. Why did the Soviets believe that NATO would attack them? How close did we come to nuclear war? And what might have happened if the Cold War went hot? The Cold War began in the aftermath of the Second World War. The United States and its NATO allies faced off against the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. But this was not a shooting war. It was a battle of ideas, capitalism versus communism. Deep mistrust led both sides to amass vast arsenals of nuclear weapons, enough to destroy the Earth a few times over. But while crises like the Berlin blockade, Korean War, and Cuban Missile Crisis kept the world on edge, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction prevented conflict. By the 1972, tensions had begun to calm, and both sides signed up to arms control agreements. But their rivalry was far from over. The 1972 had been a period of détente, but that was about to change. In 1979, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, which led then U.S. President Jimmy Carter to withdraw from the second round of strategic arms limitation talks, known as SALT II. When Ronald Reagan came to power in 1981, he then took a much more aggressive stance against the Soviet Union. He strengthened and modernized U.S. nuclear and conventional forces and sought to roll back communism in South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. Much of the fears the U.S. had felt about the general spread of communism were more imagined than real. However, it ramped up tensions and saw a deterioration of relationships between the two superpowers. The Soviets were becoming worried in a secret meeting. In May 1981, KGB Chairman Yuri Andropov declared to senior Soviet officials that the United States was preparing a surprise nuclear strike on the USSR. They had to find a way to respond. In 1981, the Soviet Union launched the largest peacetime intelligence gathering operation in its history called Operation Ryan. The rationale behind it was to be able to anticipate a surprise nuclear attack by NATO, which they believed was imminent. This was done via computer technology and human agents looking for indicators of a nuclear attack, such as increased radio traffic, the movement of large numbers of men and weapons outside of the exercises that they already knew about. One of the people tasked with carrying out Operation Ryan was Oleg Gordievsky, a British double agent inside the KGB in London. Apparently, the whole concept or idea to start watching the signs of preparation for a sudden nuclear attack was created by the military. Then it was reported to the Central Committee secretaries and the Politburo. They agreed. The conservative nucleus of the Politburo agreed entirely because it was in line with their own thinking, and they passed it as an instruction. Back to the GRU military intelligence and the KGB. For the first 2 years, Operation Ryan proved fairly uneventful. That was until 1983. Cold War tensions were about to reach staggering new heights, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war. On the 23rd of March, President Ronald Reagan announced his Star Wars initiative, which aimed to intercept incoming nuclear missiles. This was a major blow to the Soviets, as it threatened to undermine the idea of mutually assured destruction. Then, in September, the Soviets shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, believing it was a U.S. spy plane. Later, that month, the Soviet early warning system suggested that the U.S. had launched a nuclear strike. However, luckily the man on duty, Stanislav Petrov, dismissed it as a false alarm. Finally, in November, the West German Bundestag voted to allow the deployment of American Pershing I missiles within its borders. Pershing II was a medium-range ballistic missile with anything up to an 80-kiloton warhead, the equivalent of around 80,000 tons of dynamite. Unlike the bigger intercontinental ballistic missiles, which were launched from underground silos, this missile was mobile and launched from a transporter truck that carried it, and these missiles could hit the USSR in 10 minutes, giving little or no warning to the Soviets. The only way to stop an attack such as this would be to preempt it. So, by November 1983, the Soviets were in a heightened state of alert and very jumpy, but it seemed that NATO was unaware that the 5-day war game simulation they were about to undertake could have driven us towards Armageddon. The Cold War was full of military exercises on both sides. It was a key way the armed forces helped prepare for war, and 1983 was no different. Exercise Autumn Forge simulated a large-scale, conventional conflict which culminated in Able Archer when the conflict went nuclear. No troops were involved, only officers rehearsing the protocols required to authorize and execute a nuclear strike. Able Archer was an annual exercise. However, Able Archer 83 was different. To increase the realism, they changed the way that coded communications were done, as well as long periods of radio silence and the actual involvement of heads of state. The scenario begins with Soviet tanks invading Yugoslavia, then Scandinavia, followed by a mass attack on Western Europe. Overwhelmed by the size of the Soviet assault, NATO forces retreat. A few months into the imagined war, the West authorized the use of nuclear weapons. Able Archer was just a simulation, but to the Soviets, it didn't seem that way. Around the 8th or 9th of November, Gordievsky received a flash cable from KGB HQ. What did it say? This flash, do you remember? No, it was just information about this now critical situation. The Americans' exercise may be preparation for a sudden nuclear attack. Watch the signs and report immediately to us about anything unusual, particularly any special signs of the preparation and evacuation of the leading families from the American embassy or unusual activity near the Ministry of Defense and so on. The attack which NATO was simulating was exactly what the Soviets were fearful of and were trying to detect. The realism of the simulation, picked up by Soviet intelligence, strongly suggested a surprise attack was coming, and the newly arrived Pershing II missiles seemed to validate those fears. The Soviets moved on to a higher state of alert, as they had what seems to be a genuine fear that NATO were going to strike without warning. Andropov mobilized large numbers of divisions and had missiles transported to forward sites. Some Soviet bombers were even loaded up with nuclear weapons ready to go. There is debate over how close we really came to a nuclear war. Some historians question the extent to which the Soviets raised the level of alert, seeing the war scare as a piece of propaganda, manufactured by the Soviet leadership to generate hostility to the U.S. However, for others, Able, Archer was a deeply perilous moment. After all, the increased Soviet level of alert could have been matched by NATO, which might have led to a deadly spiral. But crucially, the NATO officers in charge of Able Archer chose not to respond. The man who made the decision not to escalate things was Lieutenant General Leonard Perutz, who was serving as Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, U.S. Air Forces Europe. Perutz's decision to do nothing drew veiled criticism from superior officers. They described Perutz's indecision and inaction as fortuitous if ill-informed. Nevertheless, it was this instinctive decision by those in charge that may have been the thing that made the Soviets realize this was just an exercise after all, and, by extension, saved the world from nuclear Armageddon. And when it came to that possibility of nuclear Armageddon, real or imagined, the stakes would have been soberingly high. As Gordievsky explains, to start a Holocaust, it is a great risk for personal life and welfare. Can you imagine people like Andropov, all the elderly and sick? People starting a war? How would they spend their last months of their life in the condition of a nuclear war? Who wants to have such a disastrous, uncomfortable end to their life? It was absolutely a human feeling, not a started adventure. If you're not, sure that you were going to be annihilated. But what if the West had escalated and the Soviets had attacked? Well, as outlined by Able Archer, such a conflict was likely to begin with conventional forces. In this scenario, NATO was severely outmatched. In general, the Warsaw Pact's conventional forces significantly outnumbered NATO ones. At the time, NATO had around 2.6 million personnel committed in facing Warsaw Pact countries, 13,500 main battle tanks, and 11,200 combat aircraft, including the joint West German UK Italian built Panavia Tornado GR1, like the one behind me. The RAF's GR1 aircraft was capable of carrying the British-made WWIII-177 free-fall nuclear bomb. By contrast, there were probably around 4 million Warsaw Pact personnel facing NATO, which consisted of 115 divisions of various types. Typically, they would have had fewer men than NATO divisions, but more tanks and artillery. In this scenario, as played out by Able Archer,
NATO forces could not have held the Warsaw Pact tanks for long. The forces on the border would be largely wiped out as the Soviets made deep advances until reinforcements arriving from the United States and long Soviet supply lines would begin to take their toll. But as Able Archer simulated, given the numbers on the Warsaw Pact side, NATO could not stop the Soviets without resorting to a nuclear weapon. The Able Archer scenario shows a compelling idea of how a conventional conflict can spiral into a nuclear one. The game-out situation sees NATO destroy KE with a medium-range missile such as Pershing II. This is gamed out as a warning that NATO would escalate the war if the Soviets didn't pull back. The theory behind this was one side had used the ultimate deterrent, and the shock of this should have been a wake-up to both sides, needed to step back from the brink. Perhaps unsurprisingly, in the scenario of Able Archer, this didn't happen. The simulation saw both sides' nuclear arsenals fully deployed. Most of the world was reduced to ashes. Billions were dead. Civilization ended. The use of short and medium-range tactical nuclear weapons would likely have obliterated much of Europe, not before both sides escalated to the use of long-range strategic nuclear weapons fired from submarines and missile silos around the world. There were approximately 60,000 nuclear weapons in play in 1983. If they were used on a large scale, it's likely that most of the urban settlements in the northern hemisphere would have come under attack. This is Polaris, which was the mainstay of Britain's nuclear deterrent during the 1,970 seconds and 1,980 seconds. The adoption of Polaris, which is a submarine-launched missile, saw the nuclear deterrent moving from the RAF to the Royal Navy. This variant could deliver 3 separate 200-kiloton warheads. Although small compared to the larger intercontinental ballistic missiles in terms of payload, if you compare it with the bombs dropped in Japan, which had between 13 to 26 kilotons of warhead, it gives you some idea of the destructive capacity.